The topic is Malcolm X in New York, and of course we're talking to Brother LLillard about Malcolm X in New York and some of the other experiences that you had. Why don't you continue your discussion and your first contact and your first meeting with Malcolm X?
Well, you know, Harlem for a little Southern boy was an amazing happening, just to be in Harlem, you know, and look at the legend and the history and the Renaissance of Harlem, which I didn't know a lot about, but I was, as an engineer, as a scientist, you don't read a lot of literature. But I began to realize I didn't know much about literature, or really about the Harlem Renaissance. So I was simultaneously being, you know, inundated with this whole new rhetoric from this man called Malcolm X. I was trying to catch up as a little Southern boy, not understanding the great writers that we had, you know, and I was castigating TSU's education. It's just that we didn't have the breadth of the kind of famous folks. So I was beginning to read Ball and Claude McKay and all these incredible people I had never heard of. So you can imagine this little Southern boy trying to absorb and process all of this, you know. And there's Malcolm X. There's the Nation of Islam. This man's talking about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has taught us that, the so-called Negro. I'm thinking, what is he talking about? Well, why didn't he talk like my ministers do? Why didn't he talk like Martin Luther King? And of course, about this time, it was time for the March on Washington. So in my section of Brooklyn, I'm getting involved, raising money, getting all the schools and all the daycare centers to get their buses aligned, and I'm being what I always do. I'm an organizer, I'm an engineer, I'm a layout man. I'm just busting my butt to make sure we have as many buses rolling out of my part of Brooklyn, which is East New York, right, and Bed-Stuy, to the March on Washington. And along about a month and a half before the March on Washington, Malcolm comes to us and say, why are you guys doing this? You're just little robots. They're going to tell you when to come into Washington, where to go in Washington, and when to leave. And that really made me mad, because I'm just working so hard to make this thing come about so we can prove to America that it's time for America to listen to us. And here this man is saying, you're a fool, you're a chump, you've been had, and I'm having to weigh this. And at the same time, not wanting to feel like a dummy for working hard to make this happen, at the same time questioning what is the real purpose of this march. And at the last minute, I decided not to go. But I had to work all this time, raise all this money, and I'm glad I didn't, because one of my stalwarts peers here, John Lewis, who was at the March on Washington, made a major speech, was part of the SNCC leadership, was told by the Kennedy boys and the liberal whites in the union movement what to say. So Malcolm was right. Malcolm was absolutely right. And that's exactly what happened. And you know what happened 3 weeks after the March on Washington? You can't forget that. The Birmingham bombing.
Okay,
Folks don't forget those two things together. And those are the same thing that Malcolm said. And so I had to reconsider whether or not civil rights was, at this point, should be a viable part of my everyday being. Was that my goal? And Malcolm kept talking about, well, why do you need civil rights? Because I said, Malcolm, because we're Americans and we're black Americans, and we need civil rights to correct all the horrendous, you know, wrongdoings of the past. And Malcolm said, well, a Russian coming to America does not need a civil rights. A Canadian coming to America does not need. He just put things so clearly to make us see that you're asking the wrong people. You're asking the fox to protect the hen house, to build a fence, and the key for the hen house. He just made those parallels and those contradictory statements. You had to prove him wrong. You had to look in your heart, look at America, look at the experience, and say, was Malcolm being too hard on America? Was he just not giving America a proper chance to prove what a great nation we was? And he was saying, you black folks don't even know what Africa is. You don't even identify with Africa. You think Africa is a savage place. And then he would say, why don't you examine who you are as a people? See what you've contributed to the world. See if there's a history before cotton fields in America. And those are things I never thought about. I mean, he made you look at the inconsistencies and your fears and those hidden kind of doubts you had. And when you have that many people in Harlem following this man, right, and you have not necessarily a schism in the movement between Malcolm and King, just in the setting of New York City and Harlem, King and Malcolm both had equal airtime, whereas in the South, Malcolm got almost no airtime.
Okay.
And so you had to, as a young man, as a developing social activist, determine whether or not you need to incorporate some of Malcolm's concepts. First of all, I had a joke with all the Muslims. I just love pork chops too much to be a Muslim.
Okay.
So that was my standard little joke. Well, why aren't you a Muslim? Why aren't you Islam? Well, I like pork chops. But that really wasn't the issue. I wanted to associate with them enough to inculcate some of their doctrine, some of their ideology, some of their ability to analyze where we are as a people in America, where we are as a people on the globe. What Malcolm did, he made me look at the globe. He made me look at the globe and say, you're not a minority. White man has told you you're a minority. Who the minority is Caucasians, because on the world scheme, they are the minority. And he's saying all these things, and I'm saying, where does this man come off with this new kind of idea, this new paradigm of who we are, how we should function, how we should see ourselves, how we should create our language. I'll never forget the game he told me about pool. He said, you can't even play pool without being a racist. I said, what do you mean, Malcolm? He said, look at the game of pool. You start with all the colored balls together, right? You take a white ball and knock them all to pieces, knock all of them down, and he said, how you win the game? You knock the 8 ball in the pocket. I mean, those are idioms and symbols he just made me look at, you know. And he just constantly made you understand you cannot accept the people who are saying, this is how we want you to stop oppression. If the oppressor is telling you how to stop oppression, he's saying, don't believe it, because he enjoys oppressing you. He would always say, if a man has his foot on your neck, don't take any recommendation for how to get his foot on your neck, because he's not going to do that. So again, that's the kind of feeding he kept giving me over and over again. And I constantly had to remind myself, Leo, you can't sit here and say we shall overcome forever, you know.
And so you had a personal contact with him.
Yeah, all the time. As much as I could. I'd be close up on his speeches and ask questions and raise issues, you know.
And of course, let us take this second commercial break, and we'll be back following this very short commercial break. The topic is Malcolm X.